Welcome to the RPG Goblin. In today's episode, we are going to be delving deep and exploring Pathfinder 2nd Edition. If you've just played D&D, then you've probably heard of Pathfinder before. And it's for a good reason, because it is a fantastic game, as I bring on Jack from the Dying 5 podcast to really delve deep and discuss what makes this game so special, as he talks about his switch from D&D 5e to Pathfinder 2nd Edition, and what he has learned and how much fun he has using this system. We also delve into the actual characters and the character creation and how every single choice that you make will matter and affect the game, which means when you're building your character to be a very specific way, there's actual mechanical value and there's mechanics in the game that will let you play that character that way, and it is absolutely fascinating. So if you've ever wanted to build a character in a very specific way and have the game actually support it, if you want combat that is genuinely tactful and your tactics will decide if you win or lose, and if you want to have fun running encounters again as a GM, please listen to this episode of the RPG Goblin, because those are all kinds of things that we cover in this episode. And even if you're just looking for a new game to play after everything that's been happening with D&D 5e, then listen to this episode, because Pathfinder is very similar to D&D in the ways of what kinds of stories it can tell, but it provides such a different look on how the mechanics and the game actually functions. So you may find that you might have a new favorite game just by listening to this episode, so please give it a try. So get cozy and let's get into it. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the RPG Goblin. I am your host, Willow. We have a new guest today, and we are going to be talking about a very big game, which is Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Now, if you've played D&D to any capacity, you've probably heard of Pathfinder, commonly nicknamed Mathfinder, and it is a, fantasy game that's sort of adjacent to D&D. But I personally am quite unfamiliar with it. I've seen it. I have it on my shelves. I've read through it a bit, but I really don't know how the game works. And that is why I brought on Jack from the Dying 5 podcast.
Yeah, that is me. Hello. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you on. And if you would like to introduce yourself and tell everyone what you do and what your experience with Pathfinder has been, please go ahead.
Yeah, of course. So, as you stated, my name is Jack. I am the GM for the Dying 5 podcast. We use Pathfinder 2nd Edition. We're a long-form AP, so general idea, level 1 to 20. If you're familiar with 5e, that's a pretty common level scale for you. We have an emphasis on characters and roleplay over combat and mechanics, but that being said, I do love 2nd Edition's mechanics. We have new episodes every Wednesday. Me personally, I've been GMing. I've been the forever GM of my group as pretty much as long as we've been into tabletops. The bulk of my experience is in 5th Edition, but I have a spattering of GM experience in a lot of other systems like Call of Cthulhu, some of the Warhammer Fantasy stuff, some of the Star Wars tabletops. But most of it has been in 5e. And then, probably like a year and a half ago now, I'm so bad with time. Either a year and a half, 2 years, somewhere around there, we decided to use Pathfinder 2nd Edition when we wanted to start the podcast, and then we've kind of just transitioned into using that for our home games as well. So that is my background and experience in 2e. I am by no means a expert in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, but I at least have enough of a grasp of it after playing it for a year or so now to explain some of its more, as you say, mathfindery parts.
Absolutely. That's amazing. Actually, my first question, before we get into more so Pathfinder, why did you make the switch from D&D 5th Edition to Pathfinder?
Yeah, so, that in general has been a touchy subject of late, obviously, with there's been a lot of 5e controversies, a lot of stuff. We made the switch before any of that, really. I, as a GM, was just super burnt out on 5th Edition. We'd been playing it forever, and I kind of just hit a point where I realized that a lot of the things I was throwing at my players was always could be countered with very similar things. Like, you want classes to be good at stuff, but there was never really a reason for the Warlock to not Eldritch Blast. There was never really a reason if you wanted AoE DPS to not take Fireball if you had access to it, stuff like that. As well as just on the back end, there's a lot of things in Pathfinder that are like almost subsystems that you can use if you want them. Like there's intricate chase rules, and one of the most recent adventure paths they released is about running a kingdom. So there's mechanics for like
Ooh, that's cool.
kingdom management and stuff like that. Where a lot of that stuff that I wanted to do kind of fell on me during with 5e, and
Mhm.
I just saw. I'd heard a lot about Pathfinder. I heard a lot of good things about Pathfinder Second Edition, and so I looked into it. They have all of the rules endorsed by Paizo, the people who make Pathfinder Second Edition and First Edition. All of the rules online for free on Archives of Nethys, and there's a couple other sites like that as well. So I just dived into that, and I fell in love with it. And I was like, "Yeah, we need to do this for the podcast," because I just needed a break. I was a little hesitant at first to, have our first like real big campaign in a new system be recorded,
Mhm.
but no better way to learn than by doing it. So I thought, why not just go for it?
Exactly. That's amazing. Honestly, I've had similar issues with D&D in that way, and I've only recently within the last year been DMing. So I
Yeah.
can't imagine that being a much longer experience, but that's great that you were able to find a game that worked better with the style of play that you wanted.
Yeah. I think
Uh,
that's an important thing to clarify too, is that not everyone will love Pathfinder Second Edition. I think there's a pretty
mhm,
common, not agenda isn't the word, but a pretty common like thought out there that Pathfinder Second Edition is just objectively better than D&D Fifth Edition these days. I don't think that
mhm,
is true. I like it more. I think it has more good parts than D&D does, but I recognize that I probably wouldn't have gotten into tabletops if D&D 5th edition was not as simple as it was. And there's a reason why 5th edition, other than having, one of the big arguments is 5th edition has a massive company behind it, whereas a lot of table RPGs don't. But I think a lot of its 5th edition success can be attributed to how easy it is to pick up and understand. And if you
mhm.
add all the stuff that Pathfinder adds, you kind of lose some of that. So as someone who played D&D for 7 years, Pathfinder Second Edition is incredible for me. But for someone coming into tabletops for the first time, it might not be great. And if you like the less rules heavy, more fly by the seat of your pants stuff, fifth edition might be better. I don't think objectively second edition is better, which I think is important because you can get into a lot of conversations where it's like, well, Pathfinder is just better because I like it more. But just because
Yeah.
you like it more doesn't mean other people need to like it more.
It's not one that's going to be the best game out there, which is why when I hear D&D is the best game out there, it's like, well, it can be easy to get into and start, introducing yourself into the TTRPG like space, but
Hmm.
just because that's your first game doesn't mean it's the best game. Maybe you
Yeah,
really enjoy it and the best game for you, but there's no one best game.
yeah. Because I mean, it's like with any medium, like it'd be like saying that like if you're a first person shooter fan and someone's an RPG fan and they're like, well, Skyrim's my favorite game, and you're like, well, Call of Duty's my favorite game. It's like
Mhm.
you have to understand they're just objectively different. Whereas like tabletops are the
Exactly.
same. There's some tabletops that are meant to be played for a couple sessions and then you're done with those characters. They're tabletops like D&D and Pathfinder where you're meant to play, these long sprawling campaigns that take place over years of in real world friends getting together and playing. Not to mention the
Hmm.
multiple different dice mechanics in so many systems, like D100 systems, custom dice systems, D6 systems. I just think that there's so much more out there. Even if you have found your favorite game, which I think I have found in Pathfinder, plenty of people have found in other things, I think it only serves to benefit to play more tabletops because there's a lot of them that are really good.
Absolutely. I 100% agree. This is a great start, but let's get into actually talking about Pathfinder
Yeah, yeah,
now.
yes.
So, for people who don't know what Pathfinder is,
Hmm.
what is it? What's the game?
So yeah, so Pathfinder is probably one of the easiest and yet hardest tabletops to describe because of how similar it
Hmm.
is to 5e at a surface. Because it's pretty easy to be like, well, it's similar to 5e, and it is, which is for people who have played 5e is good. It's a fantasy focused setting with a D20 system where the higher you roll, the better. Good things happens on nat 20s. You're meeting DCs. All of those things are the same. The issue where it becomes hard is that there are a lot of differences within that can, like I talked about before, between first edition, second edition of Pathfinder, and like coming from 5e to Pathfinder, you can assume things are the same where they're not. So at its core, Pathfinder second edition is in my opinion, well balanced, GM focused, player choice focused D20 fantasy setting meant for sprawling campaigns from level 1 to 20. They don't always have to be that. Paizo has put out many adventure paths that are not 1 to 20. There's some that are 1 to 10, 10 to 20, stuff like that. But it lends itself to that long form of leveled adventures that some tabletops aren't really made for. That's would be, I guess, the long-winded way to describe it. On the box, you would just call it a fantasy tabletop RPG that uses a D20 system, right?
Yeah,
but yeah,
of course. But I mean, I think it's important to talk about the advantages of the system itself. I mean, you mentioned GM focused. What do you mean by that?
Well, so when I say GM focused, I don't know if that comes from a deliberate. I mean, I'm not in Paizo's design room, whatever. I don't know if that comes from a deliberate design decision or just from GMing 5e for like 7 years and just feeling so worn out, and then coming to a system where if someone's like, my favorite example of this is things that block magic in 5th edition. I don't want to turn this into like a bashing on 5th edition episode.
Yeah, no.
But
I think it's fair to compare.
Yeah, but this is a very good analogy that makes that I think a lot of people will understand. In 5th edition, what is a monk's key? Is it magic? Is it not? I mean, it's clearly can do magical things, but it's not classified as magic in a conventional way. Can you use key in a field of anti-magic? There's no real answer to that because it's not quantified in the rules. Well, in Pathfinder 2nd edition, they have a trait system. Like everything has traits. And there's 4 types of magic: occult, arcane, primal, and divine. Not super important, but the main thing is that if something has that trait, it is considered magical. It is a magical effect. And a lot of monks stuff, like stances, and they even get spells in this, in Pathfinder, they have those traits, so they are considered magical. So I don't have to make a decision on the fly of like, well, I don't know, I guess not a monk's key. You can't use your stuff in there. Whereas I'm like, okay, well, this is what you're doing. Does it have one of those traits? It does. It doesn't work in this anti-magic field, or the anti-magic field attempts to counteract it, blah, blah, blah. Stuff like that. Over the course of playing Pathfinder, I've realized that I don't have to just make decisions on the fly anymore, that there's answers to them. There are multiple things like that, but that's like the first thing that comes to mind for me, because in 5th edition, it was always weird for me where there's stuff like that. Like what is like Divine Smite for Paladins is clearly magical, but like how does it interact with things that are also magical? Stuff like that. There's a lot of other stuff that I think CR in 5th edition has become kind of a meme at certain points. There's some things in CR that are like pretty crazy. A Banshee's a pretty common example of like having an ability that just drops you to 0, which is not really seen in a lot of other stat blocks. The thing that really clicked for me and why I say it's GM focused is specifically the encounter balancing is spot on. I vividly remember in the podcast running my first encounter that was they consider it severe, which is essentially an encounter that most of the time the party should come out on top, especially if they're at full power. But based on bad tactics, bad dice rolls, anything, you should leave the option of retreat open, essentially. It's a fight that will often be won, but not always. It's a pretty difficult fight. I threw one of those at the players. That's exactly what happened. They were basically at a point where either someone's going to die probably, or both sides retreat. They would probably win, but lose somebody, and they didn't want to lose somebody, so they just retreated. And it was such a validation of like, oh, that's how it's supposed to happen, and it happened. No more am I like throwing a bunch of creatures at the party, and then like someone rolls high damage on like a fireball, and then I'm like, well, that was supposed to be like actually a challenging encounter, but whatever. Stuff like that. The other thing is stat blocks in general are super. I've never had more fun GMing than in Pathfinder 2nd edition, because the stat blocks are actually fun to play. Like even the animals are like have distinctly different abilities. Like a bear has mechanics that help it grab you and then maul you to death.
Oh,
Where
that's
yeah,
fun.
yeah, like a bear would. Whereas a boar has mechanics that favor like hit run tactics, like long like gore
Oh,
tusk
that's so
hits. Yeah.
interesting.
Zi-
So it seems like it really like leans into and actually supports more of that tactical combat and
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
even promoting the idea of creative solutions and working with enemies that are vastly different. I like that a lot because I mean that can be hard to emulate in a lot of systems, I feel,
Hmm.
especially D&D where you're working off of stat blocks and they are usually pretty similar. I mean, until you start
Hmm.
getting into some pretty intense things, but that's even with just animals being different in the way that they
Yeah.
can attack and work, that's super interesting. Ooh, I
And
like that a lot.
there's even some. Oh wow, that was a bad voice crack, man. I should be
Oh.
long past puberty. There's even some like lesser stuff that just add flavor. Like
Mhm,
I used a Fey stat block. I can't remember what they're called, but essentially they have minuses to being intimidated because they're so meek and like easily
mhm.
forced to do things, which I think is just
Oh,
hilarious. Like they get negatives to resist being forced to do things because they're like a
I like
group
that.
of people that are conventionally forced to do things. And I'm like, that's like might not come up, but it's cool that it's in there because it adds to the
Yeah.
flavor of the stat block and stuff. There's a lot of stuff like that, and it's nice that they're not just in like the high level stuff. Like that boar and a bear, I think are level 2 creatures.
Mhm.
And the thing that Fey thing I used is a like literally the earliest game creature you could use. It's a the CR is not the same. There's not CR. It's just like creatures have levels that
Mhm.
contribute to EXP budgets you can put in encounters, blah blah blah. So there's technically creatures that are -1 level, 0, and then 1 through 20, and then above 20, blah blah blah. And then the EXP they add to an encounter is all based on their level in comparison to the party's level. So a -1 creature would be 2 levels lower than a level 1 party, whatever, blah blah blah. But like a -1 creature is the bottom of the totem pole, and it still has stuff like that,
Mhm.
which is really nice. The guys give me crap in the podcast because there was one stat block I was really looking forward to use, and they bodied it, and I never got to use its cool stuff, and I like lamented that, and I think that's funny. But I never
How dare
felt
you?
like that in yeah, exactly. I never felt like that in 5e, where I was like, oh dang, I don't get to use this enemy. I was like legitimately disappointed I didn't get to interface with the mechanics, and it was an eye opening moment because I was like, oh yeah, GMing's also supposed to be mechanically fun.
Mhm.
It doesn't have to be just like storytelling fun. It can be mechanically fun as well.
Yeah, like find the game that works best for you. And I mean, I
Yep.
think this kind of goes to the next question I have. Who is Pathfinder for? Like the type of players that Pathfinder is built for.
So I think, like with everything on the internet, certain things tend to get exaggerated and overblown. I don't think calling Pathfinder Mathfinder is incorrect, but especially from a player perspective, I think Pathfinder is a lot easier to get into than people give it credit for, mainly for two
Mhm.
things. As a player, you're often not interfacing with all of the mechanics. Yeah, there's a
Mhm.
lot of stuff in Pathfinder, but if you're a barbarian, you don't have to worry about spell casting and how does concentration work in this system and blah blah
Mhm.
blah. You just got to worry about the basic stuff like striking and moving and raging and all that stuff. So as a player, you're not really focused on the wide range of things that can seem intimidating at a glance. The other thing is once it clicks, there'll be a moment where it clicks where you like get it. There's a very
Mhm.
specific moment. It's not talked about on our podcast, like we don't talk about it openly, but they finished a fight in the podcast and they're like, oh, we get it now. We should have used this tactic in this because tactics are super important. Essentially, there was an enemy that was weak to fire and they have someone who has a lot of fire damage. And then there was a squishier spellcaster that was weak to, being focused down in melee, and they have a very speedy melee monk boy who could do that, but they didn't do that. And after the
Mhm.
fight, they realized, oh, this fight probably would have got a lot better if we did do that. It was since then their tactics have been incredible, and I think there will be a moment for everybody who gets into Pathfinder if it's the game for you. Where whether as a player or GM that clicks, where you're like, oh, this is why it's so mechanically dense, is so I can have mechanical answers to all of these problems.
Mhm.
So come around and answer your question. Who do I think Pathfinder is for? I think it's for people who want specifically mechanically, they want their role play choices and character choices and stuff to have mechanical benefits and mechanical how do you describe it? It's like they want one of my favorite things about Pathfinder is that the mechanics back up the role play in that like being an elf who is very old, you can like take an ancestry feat that because you're so old and you've seen so many non-long living people die, you're better against motion effects because you've kind of cut yourself off from like feeling those things.
Oh wow!
In another game, in a less rules heavy game, that would be flavor. I'm an old guy who's a bit of a lone wolf, an old elf who's lived a long time, and a lot of my friends have died. Now there's mechanical benefit to that part of your backstory. You literally get bonuses to your saving throws against emotion effects because you've lived so long and seen so many of your loved ones die, which I think is incredible. It's super cool to me that a lot of the things that I'm used to being like, oh, that's fun flavor in your backstory or in your character type or whatever, reflected in the mechanics as well.
It literally backs up those personal choices, those flavor personality choices. Oh, I like that a lot. But I definitely have players that really, really like the like intense flavor and backstory things when playing D&D, that then when we play, nothing comes of it.
Yeah.
I mean, we flavor things, we, adjust things, but it's never to the full effect because it's like this wasn't built into the game. That's so interesting.
Yeah. And like along the same lines, you can make things like there's a lot of ways to customize everything, like classes, ancestries are what conventionally they're called races. In most games, ancestries is what the language that Pathfinder uses. They're called ancestries. I only clarify that because if I say ancestry, I'm just talking about basically your character race. Ancestries, they're so much more customizable. You can have two completely different like elves. Like I said, you can have that. That's a first level feat you get, like that your character starts with that, where you're better against emotion effects because you've lived so long. And it also has a prerequisite of you being at least 100 years. You have to be old enough for it to make sense. Granted, 100 years in an elf's lifespan isn't too long, but it's old enough to like have lived a full mortal lifespan, so it makes sense. Whereas you can also take a first level feat called Elven Aloofness, which is basically you think you're better than everyone else, so you're harder to intimidate. Which I think is hilarious. So cool. Yeah, like both of those are first level options that you can start with. You can either be a grizzled old elf who's seen a lot of the world and is a bit cold to it, or a bit of a prick who thinks he's better than everyone else, or they're better than everyone else because they're an elf. And then there's mechanics to reflect that, where in a lot of games it would just be, well, that's how my character acts, which is pretty
it's
cool.
Almost like looking at the way that backgrounds work in D&D.
Yep.
They kind of try and do something like that, but I mean, they try and flavor in those things for you, but there's like barely mechanical benefits to backgrounds in D&D. I'll be honest. I think played maybe one character where a background like trait actually came into any use. Yeah. And that's very unfortunate because that's a decently big part of character creation, race, class, background. And you barely use anything from there. And a lot of I've gotten to the point where I don't even pick personality traits and stuff from backgrounds. I'm like, this is how I know I want to play my character.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like, why does it even matter?
Yeah.
That's super, super interesting. I mean, I'd love to more into the character creation because I've looked through Pathfinder 2nd edition a bit more than 1st edition with just flipping through the book. And I've always found the character creation to be super neat because it seems like you can just focus in on very specific ideas that you want for your character.
Yeah, I fell in love with Pathfinder getting to learn it and then running it. And I realized it was the game for me. I didn't realize that my players would have that moment too. Like the amount of character choice in ways you can take a character is absolutely incredible. Like we have in Pathfinder, champions are paladins. They're essentially the equivalent of class. So when I say champion, think paladin if you're used to 5e. champion. He made a champion that's like a shield focused, defense first focused champion where he blocks attacks with his shields and mitigates damage. And every turn now, we're at a point, not at the point where we've released because we record a bit ahead, but we're at a point level wise where he every turn gets a free reaction to shield block, which is essentially reducing physical damage by blocking it with a shield and stuff. Whereas he could have gone in completely different routes and focused on spellcasting as a champion instead, and took a bunch of focus spells and such. All like the amount of choices are great. The caveat to that is that a lot of those choices come from feats and stuff. Everything has leveled feats. You get ancestry feats all the way up until I think the last ancestry feat you get is at level 17.
Oh, wow.
I think you get them at 1, 5, 9, 13, and 17. And then, which would be every 4 levels. I realize it now. It's probably how it works. You get class feats every even level. You get new spells if you're a spellcaster. Every odd level, you're getting stuff all the time, and there's a bunch of choices. One of the best parts about 2E, in my opinion, is that one of the things I ran into a lot in 5th edition was the concept of the martial caster divide. I don't remember where I saw it, but someone put it incredibly well to me, is that, yeah, martials are really good in combat, but the amount of ways that a caster has to not even initiate combat, to stop it from ever happening, to get you out of fights, to do so many things with magic doesn't make up for the fact that when fights happen, martials are really good at them, because also casters are. They're also good in fights as well. So one of my favorite things is I've realized that gap isn't there anymore. Martials have way more utility and options and customization and spellcasting. Some people who get into are conventionally love spellcasting in 5th edition and then come to 2nd edition can feel a little bit of power loss, but it brings it more in line, so everyone's kind of on the same playing field. And it's still not. I wouldn't call it. I wouldn't say casters are not powerful. They're just everyone's as powerful as the casters now, which is one of my favorite things.
Well, I think that's great with balance, because I think there are usually those feelings between people who are playing martial characters and casters where it's like you're so much cooler than me because you can do so many things. Bringing it up, because I mean I've looked through a little bit of the monk class, and the amount of like stances and abilities and things that just you get as a monk was outstanding, because it wasn't just, the thing in D&D is like getting all the key abilities and such, which is cool, but just actually seeing that within the base class, you can take feats, the class feats, to make interesting character choices and make it more interesting in combat and make yourself more useful in combat. Just how the game is made, and not having to act like the game itself seems like it's built to make combat more interesting, that isn't fully relied on the players to make it more interesting.
Yeah, there's a good amount of mechanical depth, and it's a pretty common thing for people to come from 5th edition, especially if they have someone who is also a new GM in Pathfinder 2nd edition, to like kind of get bodied by a lot of stuff, because Pathfinder requires a level of tactics that 5th edition does not. 5th edition just basically requires that your numbers are high enough that when they grind against other numbers, you eventually come out on top. There's a lot of ways in 2nd edition that you can like make tangibly, tactically bad decisions that might cost you a fight, and stuff like that. Not to mention that the mechanical depth lends to being able to exploit or like work on like weaknesses of things. Like one of our characters in the podcast is basically a alchemist who loves throwing fire bombs. So the whole first season, I just kept throwing things at him that were weak to fire, because that's fun. It's fun when you make a character around something, you can exploit it. And it also meant that thing goes down quicker, so I can justify making it a bit harder because I know it's going to get bodied by him. There's stuff like that where proper tactics can win or lose you a fight, where I never really felt that way in 5th edition, where the choices the characters made, like moment to moment, not before the fight or after the fight or in character creation, in the moment, characters are making decisions that matter and change things and such, which I think is very fun. Yeah.
Yeah, it gives the players that special feeling like, oh man, everything matters,
Hmm.
which is the best feeling ever. But for character creation, what are the individual steps for making a character in Pathfinder?
Yeah, so essentially the first thing is ancestry, like with most things.
Mhm.
You pick your ancestry race, blah blah blah. Ancestries have two components, your heritage and then ancestry feats. Heritage is like the type of ancestry you are. So if you're an elf, cavern elves get better vision in darkness. I think they get dark
Mhm.
vision because there's low light vision and dark vision in Pathfinder, and dark vision is a lot rarer. Um,
Mhm.
I think they're called whisper elves, where they get bonuses to hearing with perception. There's ancient elves that get like innate cantrips and stuff because they're magical.
They sound like
That
cool as hell elves. Oh my god.
Yeah, yeah. So that's like your heritage, which is the type of ancestry you are, and then your ancestry
Mhm.
feats sometimes require certain heritage, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they have other prerequisites. Like with that elven one, you have to be at least 100 years old, which I
Mhm.
think is great. You get ancestry feats, like I said, at level 1, 5, 9, 13, and 17 that are everything from those elven ones I said to other stuff like the elemental types, like we'll get resistances. You can add bonuses to that type of damage and stuff.
Mhm.
One of the common things about goblins in the Pathfinder Second Edition setting is that they are pyromaniacs a lot of the time. So you can take goblin feats if you want to lean into that give you bonuses to fire and using fire, which is great.
So fun.
Stuff like that, which is really cool. The other thing to note about ancestries is there are things called versatile heritages,
Mhm.
which are some things that might be conventionally a ancestry or race in itself in other games, like Fifth Edition. Like an Aasimar is its own thing.
Mhm.
Where in Second Edition, an Aasimar or a Tiefling or any of the elementals, like in Pathfinder, they're like Ifrits in I can't remember Ifrits or the fire ones, blah blah blah, whatever. They're versatile heritage, so you can be an elf Aasimar, a human tiefling, a
Ooh.
dwarf Aasimar. You are both of those things, and that versatile heritage replaces the normal heritage you would pick for being a dwarf or whatever.
Mhm.
Which I think is really cool because again, that would normally be flavor. You would be like, yeah, I'm an Aasimar. I have all the Aasimar stats that everyone has, but I look like an elf. I'm an elf Aasimar. Where in this, you are both an elf and an Aasimar. You can take from the
That's
elf and
neat.
the Aasimar feats, whereas a dwarf Aasimar can take from the dwarf and maybe it's Aasimar. I'm saying it wrong. I've been saying it wrong this whole time.
I think I've always said it ASMR,
Yeah, I do think it
which
is
just it
Aasimar.
sounds like
Now that I think about it.
ASMR.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I never thought about that. But yeah, that is something that I think is really cool because again, it just goes back to the idea of like mechanical benefits to what would conventionally be role play decisions.
Yeah,
So
that's really cool. I like that a lot.
you pick that, and then you pick a background, which is the least impactful part of character creation because it basically
Mhm.
is just like you start with something. Normally, they come with a lore. Lores are a type of skill. It's a knowledge based skill that essentially is a focused knowledge on something. Everything from
Mhm.
mercantile lore to seafaring lore to specific creature type lores like Fey lore or elven lore or vampire lore, stuff like that. Essentially, it's a focused bit of knowledge where if you are rolling a check with that thing, DC is normally much lower.
I think that's really, really cool because again, the comparison is always going to be D&D 5th edition, unfortunately.
Yeah, yep.
In D&D, you just roll like history or intelligence checks and stuff like that no matter what it is. And like the GM can give you advantage if you have like a backstory reason of knowing more, or if you're like a ranger and you get a bonus anyway. But I
Hmm.
find that very neat that it's built into the game that you can have these specific things of knowledge that you are good at. And it's not like it doesn't seem like they're necessarily set things as well. Like it can be vampire lore, seafaring lore, and that's not like you're picking from a list. That's just
Yeah.
something you have knowledge of, which I find really, really cool.
There is a list of it, but it does say it can be whatever you want it to be.
Mhm.
What my favorite one on there is midwifery lore. You can have midwifery lore, like
That's
specific
cool.
knowledge on delivering children, which is incredible. But yeah, so lores are really interesting. And like, for example, if you like recall knowledge is like the check to like learn like what do I know about this blah 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 in
Mhm.
Pathfinder is like if you do that, if you have Fey lore, like maybe the DC on this Fey creature is a 23 to pass to hit, but if you're rolling Fey lore, it's only an 18 or something.
I like
Stuff
that.
like
That's
that
awesome.
is super cool. But yeah, so your background normally gives you the least amount of stuff, a little flavor. Like one of our players basically from their background got the lip reading feat, which just means he can read lips essentially. Which is like just a small little thing, but it's super nice when it does come up, and it has come up.
Yeah, it's fun.
They basically were in this weird magic memory where there was no sound, and he was the only one who actually knew what was being said because he can read lips.
That's cool.
Which I did not anticipate when I made that, but I was like, oh yeah, that's a really cool application of that. This is not meant to have sound, but that doesn't matter to you. You can read lips. Obviously, it has to be in a language
awesome.
they understand. But yeah, it's super cool stuff like that. So you pick your background, like which I said is probably the least important step, and then you choose a class. There's a lot of classes. Some of them more complicated than others. Everything from your staples like a bard, a sorcerer, a wizard, a barbarian, a champion, a fighter, to some less conventional stuff like what is a thaumaturge, what is a psychic, what is an oracle, what is a gunslinger. Gunslinger actually is pretty straightforward. Probably you would assume it's someone who slings guns, but stuff like that. There's every class will have options at level 1 to define, whether that's taking a feat at level 1 with most of them, whether it's picking what would be akin to your subclass at level 1, 5e, stuff like that. And then you determine your ability scores after all that stuff. Your ancestry gives you bonuses to that. Your background gives you bonuses to that. Your class gives you bonuses to that. And then you just get to put some other bonuses everywhere. Ability boosts are a bit different. Up to level 18, you're basically just increasing the modifier. So if you want to put your ability boost in wisdom and your wisdom is 10, it makes it 12. You don't go to 11 until you hit 18.
Just so much easier.
Yeah, you're just upping the number essentially. And then when you hit 18, you go by single increases. So it's pretty common to want to max out what you're best at because you only get 4 sets of ability boosts as you level up. So to get something to 22, something would have to start at 18 to go from 18 to 19, 19 to 20, 20 to 21, 21 to 22, blah, blah, blah. And then you get all the stuff down. You buy equipment, which is a lot of the things have basic packs that they recommend per class, which if you don't want to, as it's a rules-dense system, if you don't want to interface super deep with like, well, what is the positives to having manacles instead of not having them, blah, blah, blah. You can just take one of the packs that leaves you with some leftover money, and then obviously you calculate all the stuff. The general stuff. Yeah.
Then it's just, not flavor, but like it's, getting all that set up from there, and that's working with your GM and so forth. But that's really cool. Though I do have a question when it comes to classes. Are there subclasses like D&D?
No, not conventionally, and they're definitely not presented the same way. There are some classes that wouldn't have anything akin to a subclass, like monk that you said you looked into is a good example of that. All they get at level 1 is a first level feat. Everything can be defined in a way that you might conventionally like characterize a subclass. Like for example, monks have 2. These aren't the only paths, but they have 2 very distinct paths that paint a good picture of this. I'll briefly explain what focus spells are. Focus spells are essentially every class that has magic, whether they have spell slots or not, from a wizard to a champion or monk, has focus spells, which are spells specific to your class. No other class can cast those spells. Normally, they're also specific to your subclass. They don't take spell slots to cast. They auto-heighten like cantrips. They take focus points to cast, which you can get back at least 1 after every combat. So they're basically a renewable source of focused magic. That's kind of how this system Pathfinder does half casters in 5e. Like monks have focus spells, but you can also not have focus spells. The monk in our campaign has no focus spells. He did not want to do any spell casting, which is a completely viable option. All he went into was like physical focused feats and stances and stuff like that, which is completely optional. You can also go all in on a spellcasting monk, getting as many focus spells as you can, with some other sprinklings of stuff as well. Most monks want at least 1 stance that fits their playstyle and stuff. You can be a dexterity focused monk that is more about having a high AC and being very agile and having a decent to hit, but probably a little less damage because your strength isn't as high. Or you can be a super physical focused monk where you don't worry about casting and don't worry about your wisdom too much, because wisdom really only affects your spellcasting if you want to do spellcasting, blah, 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 stuff like that. So some classes don't have conventional subclasses, whereas like a wizard, you pick a field of magic to study in. Do you want to study on evocation or necromancy? Or I think you can also be a universalist, which focuses on all of them, but not as specific. So some things have what would be conventionally considered subclasses. Some things don't, and you just define what kind of that class you are with feat choices. But even the classes that have subclasses, you can also do that as well.
Absolutely. Man, I really like this because just with the way that you're describing it and the little bit that I've looked into, you can really create such specific ideas and characters in this game. It is so neat. And so that monk that decided to choose to go essentially full martial instead of taking any spell casting, because it is more balanced out between martial and spellcasters, it seems like making that choice isn't putting that monk at a disadvantage at all. While in D&D, that could happen, where you're at a disadvantage. You're only relying on, striking and stuff like that.
Yeah.
That's really cool.
Yeah, he has been incredibly competent, for sure. And each class is kind of, since it's more tightly balanced, the scaling is obviously, well, maybe not scaling, but like classes are less loose at what they can be good at. Multi-classing works completely different as well, but I won't get too into that. Essentially, each class is very good at something, and if you are not that class, you will never be as good at it. Be a little disappointing for some people if you don't understand what that is for your class and you wanted something else.
What makes that class feel more special, though?
Exactly. Thank you for saying that. Is exactly my thoughts on it. Is like, well, that's the point, right? Is like you don't want, like, fighters are the most accurate martial fighters. They have the highest to hit scaling in the game. It wouldn't be fun or fair if the wizard could get that. That makes no sense, right? Because the wizard's not supposed to have that. The wizards have the most versatility and options in spellcasting. They also get what most people would consider the best spell list, blah, blah, blah. Like, I think that is, as long as you're aware of it, I think that's a really good thing for the game, because it means that your fighter at the table will never be like, well, why am I even a fighter when I could be a wizard as well?
I like that a lot, because I do see people tend to multi-class because they want to start dipping their toes into other things, which I think can be fun. But to play, if you get a class that can play an idea super well, super specifically, that is the type of play style that you want, why would you want to switch away from it?
Yeah,
if it does exactly what you need. Oh, that's amazing. Oh,
and obviously there's
Pathfinder.
there's leeway in there. Like a fighter is very customizable. They also don't get a subclass. You basically define them with your feats as well. Like you can be a sword and board fighter who focuses on defense and shield blocking, or you can be a two-handed who focuses on like really big one single hits on a turn, or you can be archery focused, blah blah blah. So you can like further define that. It's not like every fighter is like, you're the most accurate sword boy. It's like, you're the most accurate martial. What kind of martial that is, though, is completely up to you. I think there's even a monk stance that lets you use archery, like close range archery, which I think would make for a really interesting and cool build. I've never seen it used, but I was like, that looks incredible. Like the monks thing that every monk will have, no one will ever be faster than a monk. They just get the best speed in the game. They also get the best saving throw scale. Yeah, but so they'll always be the fastest. You can like, it's not the same as multi-classing, because you don't, how multi-classing works is you don't lose levels in your main class. You essentially take dedication feats that like give you some of the abilities instead of your own feats from your class of a different class, but they're always going to be not of the same level as if you were taking that feat in that class.
Oh, that's
for example.
fun.
So you can, yeah, so you can get, like, if you can get some of the utility and abilities of a monk, but you'll never be at the same level of a monk if you were just a monk at your level, blah, blah, blah.
And it's kind of nice that it doesn't punish you for, like, losing levels and stuff like that.
Yeah, the only thing you lose out on by multiclassing is picking feats in your main class, which most of the
Mhm.
time, due to scaling, will be of a higher power than what you have. But it's a pretty common thing for spellcasters specifically because they get a spell list to draw from, which basically gives them a lot of their choices that martial feats would give. A lot of their
That is
feats
true.
aren't as flavorful or cool. So it's pretty common for
Mhm.
them to then go into a dedication because their feats aren't that amazing to begin with.
Because you got spellcasting.
Yeah, yep. And there's a pretty common variant rule called free archetype, which means you get a free archetype, like those dedications every even level as well. So you get a pick from your main class and further add mechanical and flavorful depth to your characters. We use it
Oh,
for the
that's so
podcast.
fun.
Yeah, like we have a like undead fighting focused champion who took
Mhm.
who there's an archetype. They're not just class archetypes. There's like all sorts of flavorful archetypes. One of them is purely focused around fighting undead, which is a lot of archetype
That's
feats
so
he has in
cool.
that, which is super interesting and just fun. Yeah.
Yeah, that's insanely neat. Also with the champion thing, when you were talking about it, it reminded me. I personally have a paladin in my game where the expectation when they wanted to build their character was to be a full protection
Hmm.
paladin. You know, go full shield, all of that. They want to protect other people. Damage isn't the priority. They want to protect others. And as we have been playing the game, things like attacking way out to actually protecting other party members, and protecting party members isn't as easy to do.
Hmm.
And so it's slowly become something that's faded off into the background. And when I was searching through the Pathfinder book and I showed them the champion class and I was telling them different things, they're like, I want to build my character in Pathfinder, because I was telling them all the different ways that they can use a shield, all the different like abilities they get with this, like that. It is, you can build a dedicated protector and have
Hmm.
it completely work in the game, and they were so jealous
Yeah,
over the fact.
it's exactly like you say. It's really cool. Our champion is solely dedicated to that. Like it sounds like your
That's
player wants
awesome.
to be. He is really good at mitigating his own damage. He has really good defenses. He has
Mhm.
champion abilities that reduce damage to his allies that are close to him. He almost never attacks. He's always tripping with his whip to make things prone so that everyone
That's
else who
cool.
actually deals a lot of damage gets has a higher chance of hitting and critting and all of that stuff. So
Mhm.
and it's just been really fun to see his character decisions be validated. He went one on one with this like very competent melee fighter and completely stonewalled him. I could not deal damage to him because his AC was high enough that it was tough to hit to begin with. And when I did hit, he would shield block, and he's put all of his like choices that he can as a champion to be better at that. And it was just
That's so cool.
obviously the person fighting him was frustrated, but it was really cool to see that validated of him just being like,
Mhm.
"Well, you're just screwed. I'm just better than you, and you can't hurt me." Uh, and they were in a situation
Oh, I
where
love that.
he needed to just stall until the rest of the party got there, essentially. So it
Mhm.
worked out perfectly, and it was that was one of the moments where I was like, "Yeah, this game rocks," because I just have never had a moment even close to that in fifth edition, which was really fun. So yeah,
That
if
is,
that player wants to build a champion, I know exactly how to make a champion that's exclusively defense focused.
yeah, I might try and like run something with Pathfinder just for them to try it out, because
Hmm.
it, when I was reading through that, I'm like, this is exactly what they wanted as a character. We tried so hard in D&D to do it. We tried so hard, but the options just weren't fully there. So I definitely need to try that out. Though I'm
Hmm.
curious, with so many options when it comes to character creation, have you come across characters getting decision paralysis over it?
Yeah, 100%. I don't, I think it's inevitable. The thing for me
Hmm.
though is that I kind of made it my goal to be super well informed on the players' builds
Hmm.
so that I know a lot about the classes that are being used in the campaign that I'm running. I don't know a lot
Hmm.
about the other ones because I'm hyper focused on those so that if I have a player that comes to me, like that champion that's like, I want this idea of a very defense focused thing. What feats would you recommend now that I hit level 10 or whatever?
Hmm.
I can have done enough research and looked at enough stuff to like know that like, well, so there's a couple options and here's the pros and cons to each, blah, 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 stuff like that. So I think most of they do a good job of not making feats redundant. Like if you want to be like, if you have a character idea or build idea, whether mechanically or roleplay wise, you can take feats that will empower that fantasy. And there's not a lot of decision in there if you know what that fantasy is. The decision in there then comes from like pros and cons of things. Like, yeah, this feat would give you a little bit more sustain, but this feat would give you your allies and you a little bit more sustain, but obviously less than just your sustain. So there's choices like that they can pick through and stuff. Like there's some feats in the champion stuff that player hasn't touched about, like reducing status effects on allies and such, allowing them to reduce their fear in ways that normally most classes don't have access to and stuff. So like if you have run up against a lot of frightening effects and stuff, like that might be something you want to take and stuff like that. So the decision paralysis for me, I've realized mainly comes from there's just a lot of good things to pick from. At a certain point, it's just like, well, what do you value more as a player? And normally they have enough in them to like decide, or like, yeah, I think shield blocking is more important than a little bit more healing right now, blah, blah, blah. Whereas another player would be like, we don't really have a dedicated healer. We need more healing, blah, blah, blah. Stuff like that.
And it seems like kind of the idea that you come in with, the type of character, your big idea. It seems like that can really help you make those decisions as well. And as long as you have that, and then knowing what you need within the game and your party, that definitely helps out. That's awesome.
Yeah, I think actually in the core rulebook, the first step of character creation is come up with a concept. They have that in the rulebook. It's not pick an ancestry. It's what kind of character do you want to make? Whatever that means for you, and then figure out the mechanics behind it. Which, because like you say,
I think it would be harder to do the other way around.
Yeah, for sure, absolutely, yeah.
But that is absolutely great. So I'm curious, because you've played quite a bit on your podcast and stuff, and anyone listening, please check out the Dying 5 podcast.
Thank you.
As you should. It is required. No, I mean, it's not required, but it would be awesome. Especially if you're curious in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, because I think the best way to introduce yourself to new games is through listening to an actual play, because it gives you a good idea of the rules and how it works without actually having to commit and play the game itself. So absolutely listen to the Dying 5 podcast. But I would love if you could give maybe an example of a situation that has happened in a Pathfinder game and how some of the abilities and mechanics of the game came into play, just to give people an example of how it works.
Yeah, since I praised that champion player, his name's Micah. He's great, but also dog on him a bit. The big downside to the build he's made is that he's quite slow. And Pathfinder functions on second edition functions on a completely different action system than both first edition of Pathfinder and D&D 5e. Every turn on your turn, you get 3 actions. That's just what it is. It's 3 actions. There are some things that are considered free actions that normally have a caveat to them, but don't require a use of one of those 3 actions. And then every turn you have a reaction, which always has a trigger. Most spells are at least 2 actions. Some spells can be both 1 through 3 actions, like the heal spell can be a 1 action touch heal, a 2 action ranged heal, single target that does more healing as well, or 3 action burst of healing that does AoE healing. And it's up to the decision of whoever's casting it and action wise, blah blah blah. But in that part of that system, the big thing that makes Pathfinder 2nd Edition's combat so tactical is that moving is an action now. You have to take the action to stride to move, which can be a bit off-putting for some people, but it overall just makes the game a lot better. Like, for example, with monks, a lot of what makes monks great is their ability to move so quickly saves them so many actions. They're incredible skirmishers because they can move into combat, attack move into combat with an action, attack, and all of them get flurry of blows, which basically lets them make 2 attacks in 1 action, and then retreat for their 3 actions, and they move so far away that most enemies are going to have to stride twice to even get to them, and you're wasting 2 actions of an enemy. That's just a super basic tactic for monks, right? They make great skirmishers in that way. But so the caveat to this champion's build is that his movement speed is 20 feet. It's 5 less than what It would be, but it's because he's like heavily invested in defensive stuff and he has really good armor, but it slows him down. So when he's at a distance, it's become a bit of a meme where like when they start a fight far away, he's like, well, here come the first 3 turns of combat running. So to combat that, our alchemist has taken a bunch of alchemy things that give bonuses to speed, where he's at a point where basically he has that up at all times on our champion. So now his speed's 30 feet, stuff like that. That's like a simple thing, right? He just decided to focus on defense more, so his speed's less. He realized that in combat, he's moving very slowly. There's some times where the tank, the people you want in the melee, are not getting to the melee quick enough. So the alchemist is like, okay, here's the thing that will get you there quicker. Feedback loop where it doesn't always have to be you that fixes your own problems. It can be your companions as well. That's one of the great things about having an alchemist as the party is that they can basically fill every role. That's like the unique thing about their class is that they're technically not the best at anything because they're good at everything. So that's like a super basic decision, right? There's more specific, super specific stuff like the subclass our Oracle has gives him bonus lightning damage on air and water spells that deal physical damage. So like the idea is when he sends out a blast of wind, it's also infused with lightning that deals additional damage and stuff. That's not a feat choice. That was like his subclass, so to speak. All stuff like that. Like I said, the monk, our monk player could have, been heavily spell focused. A lot of the monk spells are pretty good. All of the focus spells are pretty good, actually. That's kind of the point of them. Or he went the route he went, where he actually uses 2 swords. He doesn't even actually fight unarmed most of the time, but it's because his stance uses kicks, so he doesn't need his hands to be free, and he has a lot of options there and stuff. So there's so many things that like come up minutely as well. Like our champion character, one of his ancestry feats gives him a +1 bonus to specifically perception checks around people lying to him. So he's not better. Perception's interesting because it's not a skill anymore. It's tied to class, which I think is good because perception is kind of like if you don't take perception, you're kind of inhibiting yourself in 5th edition. It's unarguably the skill that every class benefits from. Learning about your environment and noticing things is good in the adventuring life for anybody.
Absolutely.
So now you don't have to worry about putting skill ups into it because it's based on your class and whatnot. But perception is also a catch-all for perception, investigation, and insight. It's all of those things, all of which have different like actions. You seek to like look around your environment. You sense motive to like read people. Are they lying to me? Are they under effects of magic? So he doesn't have great perception, but he has bonuses to specifically sensing motive of people. So he's not the best at perception in general, but thanks to his decisions, he's at least a little bit better at sensing people's motives and stuff. Which I think
interesting.
Yeah, it's super nice because, his in the day-to-day, like he's not going to be the dude who's like, there's a trapdoor there unless he rolls really well. But he gets little bonuses when looking out for being deceived and stuff. There's a bunch of little stuff like that.
Super cool.
Yeah,
because that's like, sure. More people focused and stuff like that. So that makes more sense because if you just have more of those skills of understanding people, those are definitely 2 different things, understanding people and being able to like look around and perceive your environment. So that's really interesting that like you can kind of still have that divide because in D&D where it is separated, you could have like a higher insight to show that. But then in this, with it still combined, you can still achieve that separation that, yes, I am better at reading people, but not as, I like that. I like that a lot.
Our Oracle has the inverse. I think he took the Whisper Oath thing I mentioned earlier, which makes him better at hearing sounds. So when sounds are involved with a perception check, he gets bonuses to it. The other thing that I really like about Pathfinder is 2nd edition is that they do secret checks, which I always thought was, I can see you don't have to use them, and I can see some people not. But I always thought it was a little weird how like a player could roll perception or insight on someone and get like a nat 20, and they're like, yeah, I completely trust them now. And it's like, well, your character really wouldn't have the context that they read them as best as they possibly could, right? So they have secret checks in this you can technically do it for everything. So, for example, if someone's looking through a room and they want to roll perception, I would roll perception behind my GM screen. I could roll really well and there could be nothing to find. And I tell them that. Yeah, you look around, you think you did a good job looking, but you just don't find anything. Or there's something to find and they roll poorly, but I tell them the exact same thing because their character wouldn't know that. Their character wouldn't know that they rolled bad and didn't find something. Their character would know that they tried their best and they didn't find anything.
So it's more
Same thing with
contested versus just a DC.
Yeah, I mean you can do it with either, but the main thing is that the characters don't have the context of what they rolled, which lends to role playing better because like someone's lying and walking you into a trap. If you roll a nat 1, you're already going to be hesitant for no other reason than rolling a nat 1. Whereas if I roll a nat 1 behind the screen, I'm just like, yeah, he seems honest. You have no reason to not trust him. And they're like, okay, and then we follow him into a trap, and then the trap sprung, and they're like, well, shit, he was lying. That's one of my favorite things. You can do that with like knowledge stuff too. Like I'm trying to identify this item which could be cursed, and if I roll low, you don't know that. But if you roll low, it's a common thing I've seen at tables where one character rolls low, and they're like, anyone else want to look at this because they know they rolled low. Whereas when you do secret checks, does it take a little bit of agency away from the player? A little bit because they're not physically rolling the dice, but it's still like using their modifier. So if they're good at perception, it's still gonna odds are in their favor. I really like that about the game because it takes away the opportunity to metagame in a way that I think is just natural for a lot of people, which it's just really hard to turn that off. It's really hard to be like, well, I crit succeeded, so I trust this guy implicitly because it's hard to be like, I don't have the context. I did really good. So that's it's a bit of a tangent, but that's one of my absolutely favorite things about this system.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I might want to try that in something just to see how it would work in an example of play and all of that. Ooh.
Yeah, it's
no, I like that because that situation actually happened one time with like a bad guy in an arc of my game where one of the players was hanging out with this person and talking with her and such, and he's like, "Hold on, I'm gonna roll an insight," and he got a nat 20, and it's like, well, now I have to be completely honest about this. And like, I don't want to like, not reward that roll. But he knew for sure whatever I was going to say was going to just be 100% the truth. Rolling that then behind the screen, keeping that secret, and then giving the information makes it so unnerving in those types of situations where it is more tense. I think it helps like it be more tense. You can create that environment a bit better.
It helps put you in the head of the character a bit more because, like you say, on one hand, you could be completely honest in what you're saying, or they could have rolled bad and they completely tricked you. They caught you hook, line, and sinker, and you just completely fell for their lie. Your character doesn't know that, which is good because it keeps them uneasy as they should be in that situation. As whether the player thinks they're good or not, they feel a bit uneasy on it. In the character as well, which is it's really cool. It's led to
seriously awesome.
A lot of interesting stuff for sure.
But yeah, no, I've specifically heard before about bringing it back to combat specifically. I've heard about the 3-action economy quite a bit, and I've heard a lot of praise for it in making combat flow easier and also being able to do a lot in combat. Have your players felt this?
Oh, yeah, 100%. The main thing, it's kind of a side effect of the 3-action system. It's not actually the 3-action system in itself, but not to go back to comparing to 5th edition again, but in 5th edition, marshals get better by rolling more attacks. In Pathfinder, marshals get better by hitting more attacks and hitting harder when they hit those attacks. Basically, better to hit and better damage. Marshals will never, you can go into builds that make you attack a bunch and whatever. Pathfinder 2nd Edition has something called MAP, or multi-attack penalty, which means when you take the strike action or any action with the attack trait, going back to traits being great, you suffer from multi-attack penalty, which means the next action you take with that has the attack trait suffers, if it's the second one on that turn, a -5 to the roll, and if it's the third one, a -10 to the roll. So basically attacking 3 times should never be the best option. That can be a bit alarming for someone coming from 5e. However, that's without the knowledge that the game is balanced around that, and that's kind of the point. There are so many other things you can do. Striding to just reposition, raising a shield is now an action. That's pretty much what the champion uses for a third action every single turn to just up their AC sum and be able to shield block, all of that stuff. There's also things that are specifically meant to like, I call them MAP management feats, which are essentially like power attack is a feat meant for basically what it allows you to do is for 2 actions you make 1 attack. That 1 action gets or that 1 attack gets bonus damage, and your multi-attack penalty increases twice at the end of it, I believe. But the caveat is that that 1 attack has your full plus instead of the -5 of 1 attack at full and then 1 attack at -5, right? So it's basically a multi-attack penalty saver. If you have those 2 actions, you should power attack instead of attacking twice. The DPS on that is just better. Same thing with something called double slice, which is meant for dual wielding. You attack, you make 2 attacks at your full attack penalty, and then it increases to your third attack penalty. But, you know, you're basically, instead of attacking once at full and then once at -5, you're attacking twice at full and then once at -10, but that last action could be used for a lot of other stuff. So there's a lot of little intricacies like that, like striding, taking an action, multi-attack penalty, which on the surface is like, wow, that's punishing. But it's because as a whole, it makes an incredibly fulfilling tactical experience in the combat of like I said, it empowers the monks to be able to cover so much ground, flurry of blows, which is 1 action, 2 attacks, stride away. There's a lot of enemies that just like can't deal with that, where they're like, I just can't keep up. I'm just charging after him and swinging once and missing, blah, blah, blah. So a lot of it is, I like it a lot. It's probably my favorite part of the system. And there's a lot of things that enemies can do to interface it with as well. Like all of those rules apply as well to enemies and such. The other big thing that makes combat more tactical is most things, especially early on, don't have an attack of opportunity.
Nice. Because that can stop so much. Attacks of opportunity, I get the intention. But it does prevent a lot of people from deciding to actually spread out and move around within combat, that then you just get stuck where you're, at least in D&D 5th edition, you get stuck in just the same exact positions because you don't want to move and get hit. It's so unfortunate.
And that's why striding takes movement, because by choosing to move away, you are then making your enemy choose to move closer, which in itself is an action tax on them to get to you, as well as on yourself. But since most things don't have an attack of opportunity, it does 2 things. It makes combat much more tactical because movement is a lot more freeform, as you just pointed out. It also makes attack of opportunities better and more important. Fighters are the only class that starts with attack of opportunity in the whole game. Oh, wow. A lot of pretty much every other martial gets it at a certain point. Like our champion now has it, but I think he got it at level 6. So it also triggers on more things. It's not just movement. It's also things that have manipulate actions. The manipulate trait tied to them, which is somatic components and spells. Getting something from your bag, anything like that also triggers an attack of opportunity. And if they crit you with that attack of opportunity, you lose that action. So way less things. God. Yeah, way less things have attack of opportunity, but it makes attack of opportunity way better. And it also opens up combat some more. A level 20 spellcasting enemy is not going to have attack of opportunity. So if you get up close to it, you don't have to worry about disengaging from it or anything. Disengage isn't a thing anymore. You like step is an action where you move 5 feet, move away, whatever. But like the act of disengaging, of moving away, you don't really have to worry about that because it's not going to have attack of opportunity. Whereas normally it's pretty evident. Like if something looks pretty martial, you're like, that probably has attack of opportunity at a certain point. But it's another fun thing that the players don't know if they have it or not. So there's been a couple times where they're like, should we move away? And they're like, I don't know if it has attack of opportunity. Screw it. Let's just do it and see if it does, whatever. And I think there was even a time where the champion tried to bait one out to see if it had it because he knew he would have the best odds of being fine if it did.
That's
stuff like
so
that.
Neat. Oh, I like that a lot. I find combat within like TTRPGs to be really interesting if they make it interesting. And so the way that you're like describing this, I really want to run a combat within Pathfinder just to see what happens. Because I've run enough combats in D&D to, know how that works. I've run some combats And they're a bit more free form in things like a Monster of the Week, which is powered by the Apocalypse game. That's pretty loose, but something that is more structured that has this like intricate combat system, I really, really want to try now. Oh my god, you're fully like convincing me on it.
It's a lot of fun. There are two big caveats to our podcast. Maybe not two. Well, yeah, two. Undeniably, Pathfinder Second Edition is a system that works arguably best not in theater of the mind.
Absolutely.
Because everything's so tactical. We do theater of the mind, and sometimes you run up against things that are like, well, since we don't have it fully mapped out, like how far away exactly and is it in feet? And so what I do the balance that is, if things are close enough, I give the benefit of the doubt to the player. If they're 125 feet away and they need to be 120 to do what they want to do, they're 120 feet away because we just can't measure it minutely. So a little bit of the tactics are lost, but not the bulk of them still remain. It is you can totally run it in theater of the mind like we do, mainly because we're an audio-only podcast. Movement. So yeah, for sure.
Absolutely.
I just didn't think using a battle map would translate well to audio-only podcasts, obviously. And
I mean, you could try.
Yeah, it's just like, I think it just lends them to talk as if they don't need to be describing everything because no one can see. It's like, well, that guy's over there. And it's like, well, what does that mean for someone who's not looking at the battle map?
Exactly.
But the other thing is, so proficiency, the numbers scale much higher in Pathfinder Second Edition than in Fifth Edition. For example, if you're proficient in something, there's technically 5 if you're untrained. There's 5 ranks of being proficient in things. Untrained, which gives you no bonuses other than the ability score it's tied to. There's trained, which gives you a +2 plus your level. Being an expert is 4 plus your level. Being a master is 6 plus your level, and being an legendary in a skill is 8 plus your level. But every time it's still plus your level. So a level 5 character innately has a +5 to everything that they're good at in comparison to a level 1 character. So the scaling can be pretty crazy sometimes. The caveat to that is the numbers get bigger, but it's still kind of the same progression in 5e of basically the further in the game you get, the more likely you are to pass on checks that you're good at. Like at level 1, you'll pass basic checks for your level at a lower rate than you will be at level 8. Even though the numbers have gotten so much bigger and the DCs have gotten bigger, the like minute math of it makes it so that like you're still technically getting better at things, even though the DCs are also going up as well.
It just looks scary.
From a glance, it can be a bit tough. The main caveat to that is we use a variant rule for the podcast where we don't do that. We don't add levels to anything. It's a bit of a controversial variant rule in the Pathfinder community. For the first time a bit back, I wouldn't call it a hate comment. That's a bit rough, but someone being like, wow, I was excited to listen. It kind of sucks that you're using this variant rule. It's like bad. I don't think it's bad. The main thing it does, well, 2 things. It's more in line with 5th edition's bounded accuracy. Not that I think that is necessarily a good thing, but the main thing it does for me is I've never been a big fan of systems where basically at the end of the game the characters are like untouchable. Pathfinder Second Edition as its base is very much a system where you go from a pretty much a nobody to one of the most competent people on the planet. And with the variant rule, that is still intact. It's just the discrepancy between levels is less crazy. Like a 4 levels higher than the party's level is basically unbeatable. Any creature 4 levels higher, because the numbers they have a +4 in comparison to everything they're good at in comparison to you, which can be tough. So I wasn't the biggest fan of that. I wanted the power scaling to like be shrunk. It doesn't make an ancient dragon any less intimidating. All it means is that instead of being quite literally untouchable, they're touchable, but they're still going to burn you to death. The main thing for people that have complained about using it is that it makes a lot of work for the GM because, I got to take the level out of everything. But I was like, well, if I'm going to do it for everything, I'm going to do it for the podcast. I'm already putting so much work into anyways, so it's a perfect way to do it. And we played a little bit before the podcast using the base rules to get like a feel for it. I still want to use the base rules for like home campaign or something to like fully understand it as well. But that's a big caveat to the podcast, is that we use that rule, which a lot of people, it's very impactful rule. All of the core of the game is still intact, of like all of that mechanical depth and combat, and like the mechanical depth added to a lot of roleplay decisions, like all of that's intact. It just like paints for a different flavor of the game for sure. Which is, I've loved it a lot, but I could see why some people wouldn't, and I can see why some people would like the rule.
Again, play style.
Yeah, exactly. One of just under the 3 action / multi-attack penalty stuff of my favorite thing in the system is critical successes and failures. In D&D 5th edition, a nat 20 on an attack roll is a critical success. It's a crit, you know. It's probably one of the it's probably the reason D&D became popular, that feeling of rolling a nat 20. How Pathfinder works is most things have 4 stages of success. They don't always have to, but we'll take like a basic strike, for example. You get a critical success on something if you roll 10 or higher than the DC you were trying to meet. So if the thing you are attacking has an AC of 15 and you roll 25 or higher, even if you didn't get a nat 20, that is a crit. Same thing with it makes for some very fun moments. Same thing with critical failure. If you roll 10 or less, you get a critical failure. That is very important for like saving throws. If the saving throw DC is 19 and you roll 9 or lower, you critically fail that fireball and you take double damage from it. Yeah, but the caveat to that is the numbers are balanced around that, so it's not. I mean, it's debilitating, but it's not as debilitating as if that was the case in 5e. Yeah, so
would be terrible.
Yeah, absolutely. So basically what it means is that like stacking bonuses to hit and penalties to enemy stats are super important, because they not only increase your chances of succeeding, they increase your chances of critically succeeding, and vice versa. Not only is our champion have the highest AC with a shield raise at 23, that also means that he gets crit way less as well, because something needs to roll a 33 to crit him. Which with the variant rules we use is not very high. But it also means that when he gets heavily debuffed and his AC is now down to 18, a 28 is much more manageable for the enemy. Same thing with other stuff. We had a fight recently where our Oracle crit failed a fear spell against him, and it was like Frighten 3, which is essentially a -3 to everything. So you have a 15% higher chance of hitting and critting in other spells. So buffs and debuffs are super important. Way more than other systems, and it just makes for a lot of cool stuff where like a fear effect, if you succeed you're like frightened 1 for a round, if you fail you're frightened 2, if you crit fail you're frightened 3 and fleeing, where if you crit succeed nothing happens. And that's another cool thing about like damage spells. If you crit succeed a fireball, you just pass. You take obviously you pass, you critically succeeded. You take no damage. The normal basic rule for like damage stuff is like a crit success is no damage, a success is half, a failure is full, a crit fail is double. It's not everything plays by those rules, but
that makes like succeeding on something like a fireball feel even more badass though. Like, you didn't hit me at all.
Yep. And there's a lot of stuff like that are really cool. Like even if you succeed a fear check, you're still frightened 1 for a round, which is a -1 to everything. Not super debilitating, but a crit success is just all that more important. The other thing is that a lot of pretty much every class has at least, I think every class has 1 saving throw. There's only 3 saving throws in Pathfinder 2nd edition. This is another design thing. Fortitude, reflex, and will, which I think is a good decision, because really any saving throw you could put into those 3 categories. Fortitude in 5th edition, like strength and con should just be one thing, reflex, like whatever. Fortitude is based on constitution. It's your physical fortitude, resisting a disease, a poison, whatever, not being blown off your feet. Reflex is, as it sounds, agility, moving away from a fireball, all of that stuff. And then will is what all of the mind stuff is, becoming feared, taking mental damage, blah blah blah. Each class, you don't pick this. This is just like class scaling. If you're a fighter, it'll just auto level on its own, whatever. Well, you pick it by picking your class, whatever. I think the only ones that pick are monks. They get to pick what they're best at. But most classes reach a point where if you succeed on a check for one of the 3 saving throws, you critically succeed. It auto ups it to
Oh,
a critical
wow.
success. Yeah. So, like for example, our champion's at that point on if he succeeds on fortitude saving throws, he gets a critical success. Just no questions asked, which is great because it means that by succeeding, nothing happens 99% of the time, which is really cool. Most casters get that for will saves. If they succeed on a will save, they critically succeed. Some enemies might have it and such, but it's a super cool mechanic.
That's really awesome.
Interesting. I guess the only other thing I didn't mention is nat 20s and nat 1s are still important. If you get a nat 20, it's not automatically a critical success. I would say 99% of the time it still will be. But what getting a nat 20 does is heightens your level of success by 1. So for example, in a normal game, let's say you're level 10 and you're fighting an ancient dragon and you roll a nat 20 to hit. That might not be a crit success. You might have actually failed even with your number bonuses. Like it has an AC of 44 and you got a 38 to hit. So that doesn't upgrade your failure into a critical success. It upgrades your failure into a success. Same with nat 1s.
Okay.
If you like roll a nat 1, but numbers wise, you still would have succeeded. You just fail instead. Like I said, most of the time, rolling a nat 1 or 20 will mean that you critically succeed or critically fail. But it's not quite that simple because, you know, in the system, you don't want to have a ancient red dragon roll a nat 1 against like feeble mind against a level like 15 character, which is good, but like not ancient dragon level, and just be like, well, you're screwed now because the numbers wise, they wouldn't actually critically fail that or whatever, blah, blah, blah. That's, like I said, most of the time you're going to crit succeed on a 20, most of the time you're going to crit fail on a 1, but it's good to still do the numbers because it might not be the case.
That's actually really, really interesting because it does. Because, I mean, nothing's worse than rolling the nat 1 on something.
Yeah, for sure.
But, like, being able to kind of, there can be some leeway in adjusting it. That is really, really interesting. Oh. I gotta look more into the rules and stuff on this now because I'm like, this is giving me some ideas for even things that I could put into my own D&D game. I mean, I would love to even, I've thought about potentially even transferring over to Pathfinder, which I'm curious because have you actually like ported a game from D&D into Pathfinder before?
Not yet. Our home game, we ended a long 5e campaign with the whole world migrating into a different universe, which is Pathfinder, because we wanted to switch to Pathfinder. But obviously in universe, they don't know that. Like in game, the characters aren't like, we're going to Pathfinder. It was all set up in game, blah, blah, blah. So we haven't done that 2e campaign yet, mainly because I just started a new job and I've been too busy to already with the podcast to do a home game at the moment.
That's so fair.
But I haven't had the chance of porting things over. I don't think you would have a lot of issues changing things other than the learning curve for you and the player and making sure that some of the differences between the two games are apparent. For example, this is my go-to when I explain like the differences in classes. Not all the classes are like this, but there's some very distinct differences going from 5e to 2e that are important to define. Barbarians are like, I think guys in 5th edition, they're just get so much health, resistant to so much damage, especially if you do the meme totem of the bear, blah blah blah, resist to everything except psychic. They're absolutely not that way in Pathfinder. They are the epitome of a glass cannon, of a melee glass cannon. They hit so hard, but they get hit so hard. So it's the epitome of I'm gonna kill you before you kill me. That I can see someone.
Really neat.
Yeah, I kind of think that's how a barbarian should be. It's kind of like the whole idea behind them. They have a lot of health, but their defenses are awful. They don't have good saves. They don't have good AC, but they hit like a truck. The whole thing is, like I said, I'm going to kill you before you kill me. Coming from 5e, though, where you're used to like being super tanky, I could see that being an issue for a player. That'd be something you'd really want to define. And you can be a tankier barbarian. You can like allocate points into Constitution and take feats that give you some utility and defensive abilities and all that stuff. Maybe take an instinct, which are like the subclasses that is a little more defense focused, blah, blah, blah. But that would be super important to like define, right? Because you don't want a player coming in like, oh yeah, I'm going to be like the tank for the party when you're not really.
Absolutely.
The other really good example is champions. Champions are not anywhere near as offensively capable as paladins. You can make an offense focused champion and do some decent stuff, But more than anything, champions are melee defensive support characters. They get a lot of focus spells that revolve around healing and buffs. A lot of their abilities, they have, I believe, they have the best armor AC scaling in the game and such.
Mhm.
Everything works on that proficiency scale of your AC, your trained expert, master, and legendary in in kinds of armor, right? So if you're an expert in heavy armor and you're level 4, that's a flat 8 bonus to your AC, not including other stuff. Blah blah blah.
Damn.
Same with like attack bonuses. So a lot of that scaling is built into classes. Like champions have the best AC scaling. They get the best armor scaling. I think it's with medium and heavy armor. Fighters get the best accuracy scaling. They're the only class outside of gunslingers that start an expert in there to hit for martial weapons, and they get the best scaling and
Wow.
like to hit and stuff. It's all balanced and really well thought out and stuff. But like stuff like that can be a bit intimidating. Otherwise, since there's so many options in Pathfinder, the only issue would be like, what options should I take to do what my character did in 5th edition? That like the choice paralysis of that. But because there's so many options, right? Or like taking a class that isn't in 2nd edition, which I don't think there's many. Like there's no, what is it? There's no warlocks.
Yeah, I was about to say there's like not there doesn't seem to be an equivalent to warlocks, at least from what I've seen in the core book.
So there is, but they're very different. There's a witch, which is exactly thematically what a warlock is. You have a patron. However, they're intelligence focused. They're not charisma focused. They're casters as well, blah, blah, blah. They're very familiar focused. Familiars are so much better, dude. Familiars are incredible. So many options and utilities. But the whole idea around a witch is you have a familiar from your patron that gives you your abilities and such. So that is like cool, an equivalent. Actually. Yeah, but like I said, it's a little different because like you're intelligence focused, you're not charisma focused, and it's very different.
Which, by the way, I don't know how much I love charisma for warlock spellcasting. I always thought that was kind of weird. Like, and same thing for even sorcerers with being a charisma caster. Those were always weird to me. So I don't mind the fact that it's a switch to intelligence for something similar because I think that's kind of cool.
Mm-hmm. I would agree. But yeah, I mean, tell me if I'm overstepping my bounds. But if you do want to do that, I'd be happy to help you port things, especially characters, because all of your like world stuff can be, ported however you want. It's your world. But new to the system, it can be a little tough to be like, okay, we have a level 5 whatever that wants to do this. There's a lot of feats. How do I do that? Stuff like that. The other thing I would say, if anyone wants to play it, try Pathfinder 2nd edition. It is not like 5th edition. Start at level 1. You do not need to start at a higher level. You are just setting yourself up for failure because you get so many extra stuff. You need to start at level 1 so that you can learn your level 1 stuff, so that by the time you're level 2, 3, 4, 5, you're not adding a bunch of stuff. You're just adding that level's worth of stuff. It's a pretty easy trap, especially coming from 5th edition, because I ever since our first couple campaigns, I never started at level 1 because it's just I don't think it's fun.
What does it do? Barely anyone gets subclasses. And you're a bit less squishy. Oh gosh, you're so squishy. Yeah. And so like you don't get a lot at level 1 for most classes. So I'm the same way. I've campaign that I'm running started at level 3. I've played in many campaigns where it started at level 3 because that's just where it gets interesting. Which is unfortunate.
Yeah. Another great part about Pathfinder 2nd edition is you get health from your ancestry as well. So your starting health at level 1 is much higher than your starting health at level 1 in 5th edition. Not to mention that there's no hit dice. You don't roll hit dice for anything. You just get the amount it tells you. Wizards get 6 plus your con every level. No rolls, no questions. Barbarians get 12 plus your con every level. And your ancestry only affects level 1. It's a one-time bonus to your health. So it can be pretty impactful at level 1, but even if you pick a class, or even if you pick a ancestry that gets like a 6 bonus on a class you want a lot of health, by the time you're level 3, that little bonus from 6 to 10 would have is only 4 in a sea of a lot more health. So it's not as impactful as some people might think it is. Especially if you want.
But it's something at level 1.
Yeah, exactly. It makes level 1 characters a lot less like, oh, I got crit by a goblin, so bye-bye. Make a new character.
I'm going into the ether.
Yep.
Goodbye.
Yep.
Well, so this makes me curious. For Pathfinder, how much player and GM support is there out there?
Yeah, so like I said, the main thing for me that is supportive is that I haven't really run into anything that without enough digging I can't find like an official ruling on. I ignore maybe ignore isn't the right word, but I don't use word for word some of the rules. I like to keep like diplomacy, intimidation, and deception pretty free form in terms of like what it does. But like for example, the what would conventionally be like the intimidation check is a coerce check to like make a creature do what you want it to do, right? It has rules for what you do on a critical success, rules on what happens on a success, a failure, and a critical failure. Like on a critical failure, not only do you fail to intimidate them to do what you want them to do or coerce them to do what you want them to do, they literally can't be coerced by you for at least a week. You do so poorly that they're like, well, fuck this dude. I don't need anything. But like there's rules for that, right? Which is great because if someone critically succeeds, you have rules to fall back on what happens. Like, for example, if they succeed, they comply for an amount of time determined by the GM, but not exceeding a day, at which point the target becomes unfriendly if they weren't already unfriendly and hostile. However, the target is too scared of you to retaliate, at least in the short term. There's rules for that if you want them. I like to keep it a little more freeform. I don't follow this by the book. It's a good thing to fall back on, though. When a character crit succeeds a diplomacy check to ask the king to give them their kingdom. It's like you have rules to tangibly fall back on for like a guideline. Obviously, the king's not going to give you the kingdom. You'll get some benefits, though. That's something that I didn't realize how much I valued it until I came from 5e. The idea that I'm like, well, I guess there's not really a rule for this, so we'll say this. And I'm not a game designer. I homebrew a lot of stuff. I'm definitely not as good and haven't put as much time as the people who made Pathfinder 2nd Edition. So their stuff's normally, better balanced and stuff like that around the other things compared to a ruling I would make by the seat of my pants. So that's one of my favorite things is if you're in a situation, I can almost guarantee there's a ruling that the system has for it. Again, you don't have to use it. I would argue if you're feeling a little iffy about it, you should at least try it out, right? I just found that I like to keep a lot of the charisma skill parts a little more freeform, so I'm not like, yeah, I mean, you threaten this dude's family and you crit succeeded, like he's going to do whatever you want. I'm not going to be like, well, it can't exceed a day of his effort or whatever, right? Or maybe he's so scared he doesn't become unfriendly. He's literally so terrified of you that he praises you or whatever, blah, blah, blah. I like to keep that open. I can see someone not liking to keep that open. The point is that the dead horse I'm beating is that there's rules for things where I'm used to there not being rules, things I can fall back on. I think the most empowering thing that Pathfinder does for players specifically is something I've continually touched on is that their choices matter, both in moment to moment choices and in the like meta choices of character creation. What you do with your 3 actions on a turn is super important. Also, what you take as your 4th level feat is super important. All of that is very empowering for a player, I found, especially talking to the guys about it. They all absolutely, like, it's just fun to see them absolutely loving the game and the choices they made. Like our Oracle taking a spell and using it and being like, that was sick. Stuff like that is really
so
cool.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I love those types of moments for players where it's just like, that's why I like the idea of the critical success being rolling 10 on top, like 10 over the DC, because those moments when someone makes that really, really big roll and then getting rewarded for that, I love that. You can, roll a D20 and that also happened. Like it makes you feel so cool.
Yeah.
Which is the whole point of those types of games.
Yeah, it's the empowerment fantasy, right? You want to be I can't cast spells. I'm not good at deceiving people, but my character is, and their numbers should reflect that, and it's fun to play that. The critical success and critical failure system is really cool because there's a lot of times where like a 1 number difference is huge. Like there's been plenty of times where something is flat-footed, which is a -2 to AC, and a hit is turned into a critical hit because of that, where like their AC is normally 17 and they rolled a 26 to hit, but since they're flat-footed, their AC is actually 15, so that's a critical hit now instead of just a hit. There's the champion debuffs a lot, so there's been plenty of times where, sure, the melee attacker still hit, but because of the debuff, they only hit with a 25 when your AC's 16, whereas if they weren't debuffed, they would have rolled a 27, which is a crit.
Oh
There's a
man.
lot of stuff where the little numbers can make a big difference. And I try to point that out when it does happen, because
Hmm.
the people who aren't like directly pumping out a lot of healing numbers or dealing a bunch of damage, it can be pretty easy to forget the contribution of the champion tripping someone, of the alchemist
Hmm.
making someone flat-footed. So I like to point out when, just so you know, this hit because it's flat-footed, or just so you know, it hit but it didn't crit because it's enfeebled. Stuff like that
Hmm.
is, I I enjoy pointing it out because it shines a spotlight on what is normally not shined a spotlight on.
Absolutely. It's just those little things. It's those little things that matter and that again makes that person feel so much cooler that oh, that little thing
Hmm.
caused this huge difference.
Yeah.
So, like I'm honestly amazed by the amount of like player agency and just how much things matter in this game because again, I am
Hmm.
used to 5th edition. So hearing all of this is absolutely fantastic. So, I think we're starting to get closer to the end, but there's still a few more things I'd like to ask.
Yeah, for sure.
So the first thing is, do you have any advice for any GMs who are wanting to play Pathfinder or run Pathfinder for the first time?
Yes, biggest piece of advice: start at level 1, especially if your main source of experience is 5th edition, and double, especially if your main source of experience is not in more rules dense systems. Like if you're coming from
Mhm.
Shadowrun, it might be a little easier because Shadowrun's pretty rules heavy. Warhammer Fantasy's pretty rules heavy. But if you're used to the more role play focused, lighter on the mechanics games, you're setting yourself up to failure to just like forget and miss a bunch of the mechanics.
Mhm.
The second advice I would give is, if all else fails, run the beginner box. The beginner adventure, i.e., the beginner box, is specifically designed to slowly introduce both the GM and the player to the mechanics of the game. It's incredibly well built.
That's
Uh,
fantastic.
I have never run it, which is, well, hypocritical is not the word, but whatever. I haven't run it, but it is a incredible tool to introduce you to the system. Even if you just
Mhm.
take the pre-generated characters that the beginner box gives you and runs through it, and then move on to your homebrew campaign, even if you just do that, it'll allow the learning curve in a very natural manner to be learned. And it doesn't throw a bunch at you right off the bat. Don't change anything in there, even if the party numbers are different. Well, I guess if you have 2 people instead of 4, maybe, but like take it easier rather than harder on them. Let them learn. You also learn. Take your time.
Mhm.
I don't make gut decisions immediately unless like you have to. Sometimes take the time to look things up, because once you do that enough, you won't have to look it up next time. The
Mhm.
beginner box is an incredible tool. Like I said, even if you just want to like get introduced to the system and then move on to all new characters, the worst that could happen is you bounce off the beginner box and then just move on to your homebrew campaign. The best that
Yeah,
can happen is all of that tactical learning curve happens before you actually get in the boots of the character you want to play. So
absolutely.
those are my 2 biggest things. Third is all of the rules are online for free on Archives of Nethys. So I like, one of the main things I do in my free time is just look at random stuff on there. Oh, I wonder what cool level 12 alchemical items there are. Oh, what do barbarians get for 16th level feats? All of that stuff. I tend to focus
That's
on.
great that it's online because that is such a useful tool.
Yeah, for sure. And they with all of OGL stuff that happened, there was a huge influx of Pathfinder, both first edition and second edition players, and
Mhm.
the archives got a bunch of like updates. Like its search feature is incredible now. You can like just look up all sorts of things, and it's just really easy to use and handy. Like if I'm like, wow, how does the trip action work? I just type in trip, it pulls up the first thing it is the trip action. It labels it that it's action. I'm like, oh, okay. A critical success is they fall prone and they take 1d6 bludgeoning damage, where just a
Mhm.
success is they fall prone. If you critically fail, you lose your balance and fall prone. Gotcha. All of that stuff is super cool and easy
Yeah,
to access.
that's great because I mean, if you are going to play a pretty rule mechanic heavy game, making it easier to actually look and find things.
Hmm.
So very important. So I'm glad that they have those types of resources that are out there. Do they happen to have any sort of like character builders, such as like a D&D Beyond type thing?
Yeah, there's a couple of them out there. I use, well, all of the guys except one like to use physical paper, which is respect, especially in a system as rules dense as this. But there's Path Builder for second edition is what I use. I'll be perfectly honest. I don't think there's anything on the level of D&D in terms of like integration and ease of access. But there's a lot of stuff out there. Path Builder is what I use. It's very good. It has a lot of ability to customize as well. There is a lot. I have never, like ever in my time playing, has basically majority been in person. I'm lucky enough to have been able to do that. So I've never dived into whether for fifth edition or Pathfinder second edition, like online tabletop tools and battle maps and stuff and like Foundry stuff. I've never done any of that. From what I hear though, from being in the 2E community on all social media and like on Reddit and stuff, there's a bunch of resources for that kind of stuff for Pathfinder second edition and a bunch of like really good resources for it. Again, I've never dived into, but I guarantee if you go onto the Pathfinder second edition subreddit, there will be a thread for it already, or you can ask somebody and be pointed to a thread. I guess that's
Absolutely.
fourth thing I'd recommend. Join the Pathfinder second edition subreddit. It's run really well. I have learned so much on there. The people who run it do a really good job, and it's quite welcoming. Like with anywhere on the internet, there's bad apples, but you know it's kind of inevitable at a certain point, especially on Reddit. But you know,
You know. No, that's absolutely fantastic though, because with online play being more popular currently, I honestly
mhm.
wouldn't be surprised if it was more popular than playing in person at this point.
Yeah.
Having good tools for playing online, whether it be like on Roll20, just playing in a Zoom call or whatever, having the tools to
Mhm.
just be able to build the character, all of that is super, super important. So that's fantastic. Man, I am very much excited to look into this more. And actually, so with Pathfinder, it's great for long-term play where you're leveling up your character the entire time, get to level 20, blah blah blah.
Mhm.
How well does it work in short arcs slash campaigns or even one shots?
I think pretty well. I one shots might be a bit tough if you're new. I wouldn't recommend
Hmm.
doing any one shots in terms of like higher level characters and such. A first
Hmm.
level one shot would be fine. The main thing you run into is that you can do it once you get enough system experience, but like I said, you get so many options for so many specific situations and different things that it can be hard jumping into a higher level character when you don't have the experience of knowing the past levels of play to inform when things are useful and when they're not. In
Absolutely.
terms of short bursts, it's incredible. I have structured the podcast as essentially 4 seasons of 5 levels each season, which each in their own could conceivably just be like a 5 level campaign, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
We're structuring it so that like the story continues all the way up until level 20 to the end, but
That's
conceivably
fantastic.
any of those chunks could have been just like started at level 1, ended at level 6, there's the campaign, to any
Hmm.
mix of couple levels and stuff. So I think it works
That's great.
well for any amount of like leveling, from like if you want to do 2 to 4, just like a 2 quick level campaign, keep it nice and simple, stuff like that. The other thing is that
Hmm.
leveling is not exponential in this. I use milestone leveling mainly because it's easier
Hmm.
for me in the podcast form. You could totally use EXP leveling. It takes 1000 EXP to get from every level to every level. There's no exponential leveling, so like once you're level 19, you play for 3 years to get to level 20. It's 1000 EXP to get from level 1 to 2. It's 1000 EXP to get from level 2, or to get to level 19 to 20. The caveat being
Interesting.
that EXP amounts are determined by what you are doing in relation to your level. So a level
Hmm.
5 creature when you're level 5 will give more EXP than a level 5 creature when you're level 8 and stuff like that.
Yeah, that makes
Um,
a lot of sense. Actually, that reminds me, is there something of actually gaining XP out of combat in Pathfinder?
oh yeah, one of the most popular adventure paths. It's about being in a magic school and stuff. I forget what it is, but it gives out experience almost more for out of combat stuff than in combat stuff. I have the GM screen in front of me. There is suggestions for amount of EXP for simple stuff, like a minor accomplishment you should award 10 EXP for, a moderate is 30 EXP, and a major accomplishment is 80 EXP. And that has nothing to do with combat. It's just like a in-world accomplishment of that level. Maybe returning a cat to an old lady is 10 EXP. Maybe closing a portal to a different realm is 80 EXP, as well as the EXP that came from fighting the things in it. There's also a lot of stuff in there that awards EXP whether they succeed or not. Like overcoming a trap, whether they spring it and get hit by it or disable it, still awards the same amount of EXP, because it's like if you start failing too much, you could just snowball and not level up quick enough, right? So there's a lot of the adventure pass give EXP for non-combat stuff. And there are rules for how to give out that EXP for non-combat stuff, which is good, because I always thought that was very weird how the only way to level up in 5th edition is by killing things, when some of your abilities aren't about killing things.
It's like a Brennan Lee Mulligan bit that I saw where he was like going on a whole rant about a wizarding school instead of, if it's just by killing things, and it's like, oh, instead of studying, your spells and stuff, let's go out and kill a bunch of goblins.
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
That's actually really cool that it does that. I like that a lot, because it makes, I think, the players, especially if you're doing experience leveling, it makes them think of opportunities for that then they can actually explore things more and explore what their character may do, or actually they want to solve these problems that don't involve combat because they know they will get an award for it or a reward for it.
I don't remember where. Sorry, real quick before I forget this. I don't remember where, but I'm pretty sure there's a thing where it's like, even if your party doesn't fight and kill the enemies in a combat, like they talk their way through it, you still award the EXP as if they'd fought it, right?
Perfect.
Because that's even better than fighting. You don't waste any resources. No one has to die, but you overcame it in arguably a better way than fighting it. So, which would always be weird, because like in 5e, it would be like, there goes that EXP you could have got.
But then you can reward the players for, role playing, social interaction, even resources that might resolve around that, and making it so that abilities that use, kind of the insight thing. If you can get an idea of their motivation, that you can use that ability that you have to then win a combat by not fighting. Like, that's so cool, the fact that you can use those types of things, and it's not just, oh, this is flavor or personality. It is something that you can legitimately use within the game. Amazing.
Yeah, I love it a lot. It's pretty cool. In the Game Master's Guide, they also have some pretty in-depth rules for 2 types of encounters, which are social encounters and research encounters. I won't get too into it, but essentially there's rules for like a bunch of different checks and a bunch of different things you can learn, and accruing research points in a setting where you're like spending a bunch of time looking at something, blah blah blah. Same with like a social encounter. I think the example they give is convincing a owner of a theater to like do something, and a bunch of different things come into play, and depending on the outcome and such, it's like there's rules to do those things more intricately if you would like it to be that way, or you think it deserves to be that way, than just roll Arcana, see what you get. It's like a multi-stage counter as opposed to just like a check or so. I have used a little bit. I haven't used as much as I'd like to, but yeah, those are really cool too, because it straight up the designers being like, yeah, if you want more depth to this specific social or like research encounter, here's how you do it. And I would recommend anyone who is if you hear that and you're like, that sounds cool, to look into it. It could easily be implemented in 5e as well. All that would change would just be like numbers scaling would be different, in the skills that you would use and stuff would be different for the most part. But yeah, that's one of the things I really like too.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Man, this sounds really, really awesome. I might have to convince my group to play. Just like, here, let's try it out, see what happens. But yeah, so is there any, before I have one last question, but is there anything before that you haven't mentioned that you think should be mentioned before we end?
Yeah, one thing, and it is specifically about how healing works in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. You can So the medicine skill is used to heal. It has an action called Treat Wounds, which you roll medicine against a DC you choose. You can only pick the higher DCs if you're high enough proficiency to choose them. You can do it once every hour. You can get feats once you level up to do it more often than that. But essentially, it's a great mechanic for topping off the party between fights, not using magic. And since it's tied to skills, you can conceivably have anyone be your medic or backup medic if they want to put the skill increase investments into medicine and a little bit of wisdom and whatnot. Obviously, it's kind of like makes sense if you're already wisdom focused. But that is really nice. I forget who it was. I'm in a Discord with a bunch of other podcasters and stuff for stuff. And there's another Pathfinder 2nd Edition GM podcast in there where in his home game the barbarian is their backup medic because they put some stuff into treat wounds or into medicine, and they can treat wounds competently if the medic goes down and such. Healing magic still has its place and is still very useful, but it's super nice to have an option for healing that isn't magical, and you will suffer a little bit if you don't have a magical healer, but not in the way that you will in 5e, where it's kind of like expected. If you don't have someone who can heal, it's pretty rough. Like, how are you supposed to get through a lot of combats? Where 2nd edition kind of functions with the idea that everyone's pretty much topped off after most fights. It even talks about this in the encounter budget rules of like, these are the level of difficulty for things if the party is at full power, full health. These are how difficult things will be if that is not the case. Which I
love
think
that they actually consider those things.
Yeah, it's an important thing to consider, right? Like the highest level encounter, an extreme encounter, is like basically on the levels of the player characters if they're at completely full strength. Like everything they have is on the table. Otherwise, they're probably going to lose, which is why it's like this should probably be used only once ever in a campaign, and it's if you want to top it off, like finish it off, the big fight at the end. Which I didn't realize how nice it was really for just like the flavor of the game to have non-magical healing be so great, because it allows for both in-world and in the party a normal like conventional healer to both mechanically function and like shine as well. We're a little weird because our magical healer is also the medic healer, but like it's cool to see him not always just be like, yeah, I heal spell you. He's like, yeah, I bandage your wounds and all that other stuff as well.
Yeah, you have a choice, and you don't have to waste, not waste, but you don't have to use the spell slots on that either.
Exactly. Yep. It makes magical healing more reserved for in combat more than anything.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's really, really cool. Because like, let's say you're just going through a dungeon and you get hit by a trap and you go down, not go down, but you lose a lot of health. You can just normal heal. And then combat later, magical heal. Oh, man, that's cool. I like that a lot. That's really awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's trade-offs to it. Like, it takes 10 minutes to do. Sometimes you won't have that amount of time. Sometimes you'll have to ask yourself if that amount of time is worth it. We could either heal everybody up and allow the villains to get a 30-minute head start on escaping, or we go after them wounded. It creates a lot of, like, just organic decisions like that as well, which is, I mean, that's what you play tabletops for, is making those decisions as a character. So,
absolutely. Yeah, no, honestly, I mean, I knew some things about Pathfinder before this, but I did not realize how heavy it was within tactics until this conversation, and I am absolutely amazed. I do like tactical combat is super, super fun in games, and D&D can do it to an extent. You got to kind of mess around with encounter building and stuff like that, but all of the resources that Pathfinder 2nd Edition gives you to build those combats correctly, to have your players not just rely on hitting 3 times in a row, all kinds of stuff like that just lends itself to this really interesting tactical combat where also running away does seem like a completely viable option.
Yeah. And it also, go back to the opportunity attack, it's really empowering once you have opportunity attack, because I play enemies like the players do, where like sometimes they assume or aren't. Like a wolf isn't like, oh, I'm going to get opportunity attacked if I run away. It's just going to run away. It's a wild animal. So when you have an opportunity attack and you can hit it, it feels good. It's nice. not to mention the mechanical depth of stat blocks. You can make a whole arc of a campaign based around gearing up to fight a creature that is very powerful but has a very specific weakness. Lycanthrope's weakness to silver, vampires have a long list of very specific weaknesses, all of that stuff. The mechanical depth just every time I look at a new stat block, I'm like, oh, that'd be so cool to use in the podcast. Obviously, I can't do that because I just don't run enough encounters to do that. And it'd be kind of weird if out of nowhere I'm like, well, this arc has nothing to do with dragons, but here's a dragon. But yeah, it's a lot of fun for sure.
Yeah, that's seriously amazing. And I think we come to the point of the last question, which may be a bit of a loaded question, but I'm
Okay.
curious on what you would say. Why do you love Pathfinder 2nd Edition?
Yeah. Well, if you listen to the podcast, I hope you at least have an in-depth understanding of why I love it. But to distill it down into something, in a more concise thing, I had a long Twitter post about this. But why I love Pathfinder 2nd Edition is because after 7 years of just being worn down by the same tactics, by the same stat blocks functioning almost identical outside of a couple different flavors in 5th edition, after that just being grinded down in like creatively by throwing myself against that over and over and over again, it was unbelievably empowering to play stat blocks that have unique intricacies that are pretty easy to pick up on. Like with the boar, it's like, oh, it's hit and run. You see the ability that lets it stride twice and hit in 2 actions. You're like, oh, this is a hit and run creature. To see that in stat blocks and be able to do that and give that flavor to combat for my players, not to mention the players making decisions, both micro and macro decisions in like the moment to moment gameplay and the like character decisions behind the scenes gameplay of like what feats to pick up and stuff. Seeing that come to fruition, the main time that did was when, like I said, that champion completely stonewalled the melee fighter because of all the decisions they made to do that. Obviously, it was frustrating for that person that was fighting him, but it was so validating to see a player who I had never seen their decisions play out like that before in 5th edition to just have that moment is I honestly just like I don't know if I could ever go back to 5th edition when moments like that happen consistently enough in Pathfinder that I'm like, this is great. This is why I play tabletops, is to have that power fantasy of specific things that your choices determine. And that's why I love Pathfinder 2nd edition.
That is amazing. Seriously, thank you so much for coming on and talking to me about this, because I am 100% convinced on trying Pathfinder, because I've wanted to, but like this right here just convinced me 100% to do so, because I mean, I think there is nothing better to convince someone to play a game than to hear someone who really loves it.
Yeah, I mean, that's the whole point of your podcast, right? That's like the whole idea behind it is...
Exactly. I mean, that's why that's the direction I want to go, because every time that I hear someone talk about a game they love, I can't help but want to play it 100%.
Yeah, I mean, and passion is infectious. Absolutely.
It really, truly is. So thank you so much, because that right there, just why you love it, was amazing. So thank you so much for coming on and talking about Pathfinder with me. This was a great time.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Please, everyone who is listening, please go and check out Jack on Dying 5 podcast and, listen to them play Pathfinder, because you should, because it's an awesome game and Jack's awesome, and just be supportive and be awesome.
Yeah. That should be a tagline somewhere. Be supportive and be awesome.
Be supportive and be awesome.
I will say, like I said, Pathfinder 2nd Edition might not be for everybody. I'm a strong believer that even if you have a favorite game, you should play as many games as... You should have a wide range of games to play. There's a lot of good games out there that I've played, as well as Pathfinder. So, I mean, obviously, if it wasn't evident, I love Pathfinder 2nd Edition, but I love a lot of games. So, yeah. Thanks for having me. This was a lot of fun. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you had a great time, because I did as well. But I completely agree. Even if Pathfinder doesn't seem like the game for you, just check it out. See if it's something that you might even find inspiration from. It's awesome. But yeah. 100%. Thank you for coming on, and I think that's the end. So, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, no problem.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the RPG Goblin. I really hope that you enjoyed, and I really hope that you go and check out Pathfinder 2nd Edition because it is absolutely fascinating, especially from someone who comes from originally playing D&D and just hearing those comparisons. And if you've been enjoying the RPG Goblin so far, I would really, really appreciate it if you left a review or even rated us on wherever you listen to your podcasts. Every little bit of support helps keep this podcast going and just fills me with so much joy that I can't even quite express. This has been just such a fun project for me, and I really hope to continue it and to open up the world for even more games for even more people. If you enjoyed Jack and what he had to say about Pathfinder, please go check out his podcast. Again, it is the Dying 5 podcast, and they are a Pathfinder 2nd Edition actual play podcast. If you want to hear the stories and know what happens, if you want to hear how Pathfinder is actually run, or if you want to just hear the insane builds of his players, aka the Paladin, please go check out the podcast. It is available wherever you can find your podcast, and you can find the Dying 5 podcast on Twitter at Dying5. If you've enjoyed the RPG Goblin, please make sure to also check us out on Twitter at the RPG Goblin and on Instagram at the RPG Goblin with a dot between each word. If you really enjoyed exploring Pathfinder 2nd Edition in this episode, well, you may enjoy the next episode of the RPG Goblin as well, as it will be coming out June 23rd, and it is going to be about Pathfinder 1st Edition, as I bring on Jeff from Big Campaign Podcast to explore and to talk all about it, which I am so excited for you to hear. So please make sure to keep an eye out for when that comes out, which will be next week, again, June 23rd. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next week.